Who'd like to start? Pegor, what's your question?
Is there an upper limit to how much abdicated responsibility you can take on?
Okay, excellent. Is there an upper limit? Very nice. All right, who'd like to go next? No questions? What is this?
Okay, I got one question.
Go ahead.
Is there value in taking on responsibility without inspiration?
Very nice. Responsibility without inspiration. Excellent. Thank you. Next up is Claire. Claire, you had a question?
When are there, how do you check when you have ulterior motives to taking on responsibility?
Very good. Ulterior motives.
We discussed a little bit about ego or kind of the other avoidance of other types of responsibility.
Got it. Excellent. Excellent question. All right. Next up, Nick, what's your question?
Yep, just there for the quick backstory there. In I couldn't find the exact quote, but Peterson talks about as organizations or societies, whatever age, they end up taking on this willful blindness. And my question was, how do you avoid willful blindness when you are the organization ages or matures?
Wonderful. How do you avoid willful blindness? Willful blindness. Excellent. All right. Next up is going to be Brian, Kevin, Joe, and Jonathan. Brian. Brian, you need to unmute yourself. Nope. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, this is based on a long, very useful discussion in our group about shared responsibility. Have you abdicated responsibility when those around you are possibly better prepared and better positioned to act?
Okay, can you repeat that again, please?
So it's about shared responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
Have you abdicated responsibility when those around you are better positioned to act?
Got it. Okay. Responsibility when other people. Okay. Very good. Thank you. Next up is Kevin. Kevin, what's your question?
Yes, thank you. The question is regarding to a second question asked on the group about Peter Pan, Let It Go, and also related to Brian. My question is, should the individual responsibility align to common ground with others, community, system, country by country? Thank you.
Okay, very good. Individual responsibility and community or
line, yeah.
Social responsibility, individual responsibility and community. Okay, very good. Thank you. Next up is going to be Joe, Jonathan, Maritza, Judith, and Jean. Joe.
I'm like trying to come up with something just as we speak, but I think it's a fair question to ask. Can you abdicate your responsibility and still be happy?
Okay, very good. Can you abdicate and be happy? Be happy. Okay, very good. Thank you. Next up is Jonathan. Jonathan, what's your question?
Growing up, I remember Peter Pan being like a hero, like liking him a lot as a kid. And now, going through it in these recent lectures, he's not necessarily a role model, right? And so my question is, why is Peter Pan charismatic? Why is he such a charismatic figure if he's not something we should be? Why does he come off like that?
Wonderful, very good. Why is Peter Pan charismatic when he's not a good role model? Okay, excellent. Next up is going to be Maritza. Maritza, go ahead.
I actually want to look at it from the flip side. If you are a very responsible person and you're taking on all the responsibilities, when should you abdicate some responsibilities?
Wonderful. And should you abdicate? Very nice. All right, excellent. So these are fantastic questions. Next up is going to be Judith, Jean, and Ray and Jade. Judith.
Well, pretty much exactly the question Maritza just asked. How do you set boundaries and or limits on responsibilities? You know, identifying, you know, the competing responsibilities and which ones you abdicate.
Wonderful. How do you set limits on responsibilities? Excellent. Next up is Jean.
Yeah, my question is, if you really like to do what you're supposed to do you still call it responsibility?
Very nice. Okay, if you like it, like doing this, do you call it responsibility? Very nice. Okay, next up is Ray. Ray, go ahead.
So my question is suffering necessary, or can we experience joy in each and every moment?
Very good. Is suffering necessary, or is joy possible all the time? Okay, very good.
Thank you. Thank you.
Next up is Jade. Jade, what's your question?
I think it's worthwhile to consider what are the pros, cons, or the differences, even if we're not looking at them as pros and cons, of distinct and clear division of labor, and how that affects the concepts of abdicating or just spontaneously taking responsibility.
Wonderful. What are the pros and cons of division and labor, and how does that relate to responsibility? Okay, all right. These are amazing questions. So folks, now it's time for lightning round. We got all these questions. What you have to do is that you have to answer it in brief. You have to answer it in 1 to 3 sentences. If you're talking really, really good things, you can go up to 5 sentences. Okay, but try to be brief, because what you want is we want to get all these different perspectives on it. Okay, so again, the same rules. Go ahead and put a exclamation mark. Okay. Is there an upper limit to accepting of responsibilities? When is it? What's the upper limit? Jean, what's the upper limit?
I think the upper limit is how much you can handle, how much energy you have.
Wonderful. Roger.
Jean basically just took it. I was going to say, whenever it starts affecting your ability to complete your responsibilities, like when it starts to fall itself apart by itself.
Wonderful. Maritza.
Same thing. Thanks, Roger.
Sorry.
Jean, you basically got two people to be speechless, who are usually never speechless. Next up is Claire, followed by Jade. Claire.
Yep. I agree with them. These people are brilliant.
Excellent. Jade.
I think it's basically also, yes, what can you handle, but what are you actually qualified to do? Because sometimes we'll decide we can handle things and we feel like things are going okay, but we aren't necessarily qualified or have the skills or the knowledge to do or take care or intervene.
Thank you. Next up is John. What do you think?
Yeah, I think I'm going to let Jean take responsibility for my answer.
Okay. That's a great way of abdicating responsibility to Jean. But Jean, so let's take, okay, let's look at this. Let's just go in order. What is the relationship between, is it proper to take responsibility when there is no inspiration? Is there a, what is the connection between inspiration and responsibility? Becky.
Yes, you can definitely take responsibility without inspiration.
Okay, next up is Jean, followed by Judith. Jean.
I say no. I think if you better do something else, more inspiring, you can contribute more with more energy.
Thank you. Next up is Judith, Jyoti, and Jonathan.
Yes, I think you should take responsibility even when it's not inspiring.
Wonderful. It's all J's now. So it's going to be Jyoti, So Judith, Jyoti, Jonathan, Joe, and then Nick and Dave. So Jyoti, go ahead.
Yeah, inspiration is a big motivating factor. However, it depends on the situation. I think one should go ahead and take the responsibility anyway.
Thank you. John.
As far as opportunity is concerned, absolutely. You should take responsibility when they're not necessarily inspiration, because inspiration could be hiding in the muck. In fact, I think the greatest inspiration is often problems that seem wicked and confounding at first.
Wonderful. Next up is Joe, Nick, Dave, and Maritza. Joe.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. And it's also maybe an ethical situation where it is a difficult decision to take responsibility. So I think that you don't necessarily, I mean, ethics can inspire you, but, you know, it doesn't necessarily, the situation may not be inspiring.
Wonderful. Next up is Nick. Nick.
Yep, I'd say that, yes, you should, because sometimes in life you have to do what is necessary, not what you necessarily want to do.
Wonderful. Dave.
Yeah, I think what hasn't been mentioned yet is the organization. Organizations are imperfect. And if I see something that needs to get done, I want my organization to succeed. So I may make a little extra to make sure we're accomplishing things, we're successful. Thank you.
Thank you. Maritza.
I think that one can, but I honestly don't think one should. I think instead one should reframe one's thinking and find a way to be inspired by every responsibility that one takes on.
Excellent. Next up is going to be Chad, Aiden, Becky, and Kevin. Chad. Chad, you need to unmute yourself.
Oh, thank you. I'd say if you have two options that are mutually exclusive, you should choose the one you're inspired to do unless you're morally obligated. But if you're morally obligated to do something, or if your rationing mind tells you it's smart, a lot of times motivation kicks in after you start an action based on cognitive behavioral therapy. So sometimes you just kind of have to begin and hope for inspiration later.
Thank you. Next up is Aiden, Becky, and Kevin. Aiden.
Yeah, just quickly, I mean, I come from a creative background, but it could work in any job perhaps. Having the craft or the competence and owning that in terms of, you know, hitting goals and hitting dates and these kinds of things is very important. And being like, if from a music point of view, so when inspiration comes, you have an outlet, you have a craft, you can, so it's maybe write it as fuel, but it may come and go. And staying on track between, I don't know. I think they're related instead of one or the other. That's kind of my point.
Excellent, excellent. Next up is Becky. Becky.
It's a good opportunity to build discipline when you're lacking that inspiration. But oftentimes when you spend time, when you invest time in doing something, your mind will start to value that. And so the inspiration might be developed later on.
Excellent. Kevin.
It's a situation-based circumvent and culture, especially in corporation.
Thank you. Next question. This is about ulterior motive. How do you tell that what you're trying to do actually has an ulterior motive than what it seems to be to you or others on the surface? Anybody? Firstly, okay, go ahead. It's going to be Judith, followed by Joe. Judith.
I think that requires some self-reflection, like on a daily basis anyway. Like you should be thinking about maybe what you're doing all the time. How am I living my life? How am I living at work? How am I living at home? What are my actions? And just generally reflect, because, you know, if you don't reflect on the way you live, then you can end up just, blindly following some kind of path. So I just think that's a good thing anyway. And then that's when you will know if your instincts will tell you that there'll be a little voice that'll tell you, no, I'm not doing this for the right reason.
Wonderful. Next up is Joe, Jyoti, and Ray. Joe.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to have a set of principles by which that you're guiding your life and values in order to even make that kind of decision. So, for example, I think in the chapter is, and this is just Jordan Peterson's opinion, because there are people that think about pursuing pleasure as a principle in their lives. If that's a principle that's guiding you, that's how you know how to make a decision. Just as it is if it were a virtue for a Stoic or something along those lines. So you need a set of principles and a philosophy of life in order to make a decision.
Thank you.
That kind of judgment.
Thanks, Joe. Next up is Jyoti, Ray, Jean, Becky, and Kevin. Jyoti.
Yeah, if as long as a person is following the moral codes, I think one should just, other people who are not taking the initiative and this person is doing it, so be it. What difference does it make?
Next up is Ray. Thanks, Jyoti.
In my opinion, I feel it's making a decision to being conscious rather than unconscious, and to really engaging in all of your senses. Very much easier said than to do, but really practicing consciousness as opposed to the blind following of being unconscious. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Next up is Jean, Becky, and Kevin. Jean.
Yeah, I think you have to have a purpose and goal in life. If it's aligned with that, then you take it. If not, then just focus on something else.
Thank you. Becky.
If you start with why, it's very subjective and it's subject to a lot of rationalization. But if you look at the objective, what are the benefits? What are the results of taking this on? Then that can better inform you what your reasons may be, and you can generate all the possibilities, including the ulterior motives, which you wouldn't have originally thought of.
Excellent. Thank you, Becky. Next up is Kevin, Claire, and Aiden. Kevin.
Follow your heart to think positively, then take the right responsibility.
Thank you. Claire.
I think in the case of sort of ego being an alternative motive, leaning on that truth telling and being well integrated and trusting that internal gut. If potentially the downward spiral is that it will become unsustainable, making sure, to go to the brick metaphor, that you're not adding a brick that is pulling off a brick that is holding up the cathedral down below, and just checking that.
Wonderful. Thank you, Claire. Next up is Aiden.
Yeah, I would say this is a very tricky answer in that it takes an inordinate amount of self-awareness, the answer that I would think, but it would be to check if the intended or hoped for payoff is beyond the scope of what would be objectively reasonable and whatever the project is. In terms of it's my whole value, if it's all my joy, if it shows that I'm worth something, it's beyond the scope of completing a project, for example.
Very nice. Thank you, Aiden. Next question. How do you avoid willful blindness that often comes when organizations kind of grow older, or when you've been doing something for a long period of time? How do you avoid willful blindness of set habits, whether within a person or within an organization? Joe.
Just one word: courage. And you have to be willing to accept the consequences.
Wonderful. Jean.
I see it's exposure. So you interact with people differently, different opinion, different background. Usually you can see what's possible, so what you haven't done yet.
Wonderful. Judith, Jade, and Kevin. Judith.
listen to other perspectives, look for other points of view outside of the way you are thinking, actively look for those.
Wonderful. Jade.
I'm feeling like having a framework of a value system is very important, because if you have a value system, it guides your behavior, it guides your decisions, and you usually won't fall to the wayside on certain things. And also have a value system that I don't want to say you're reevaluating, but you're reevaluating the expression of your value system when circumstances as your organization develops. Like, is this approach to this value still giving us the value we're looking for?
Excellent.
Yeah.
Next up is Kevin, Ray.
Because rules can't do
Roger.
that.
What's that?
Rules can't do that. Rules don't have the flexibility. But if you're principled, like if you have principles flexible, you adjust to what's in front of you. Rules are just like, if someone comes, this is what we do. If you have principles, like someone comes, they're hungry, they don't have money. Yeah, I can give them a burger. But if it's a rule, you have to pay and you're not going to give them a burger.
Thank you.
So it's like you know.
Wonderful. Excellent distinction. Next up is Kevin, Ray, Roger, Becky, and Victor. Kevin.
Check the blindness is own blind spot or others. If it's your own, check, approve yourself. If it's others, you try find a good opportunity, talk to the right people.
Thank you. Next up is Ray.
Thank you again. So in my opinion, I feel that willful blindness comes from being unconscious. So I've heard from some other schools of thoughts, it's checking in with yourself every hour. So on the top of the hour, where am I? Where are my thoughts? What am I thinking? Some other school of thoughts are just having a simple elastic band around your wrist and just pulling that band just to bring you back and to center yourself in terms of where you are.
Wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up is Roger.
Yeah, something that place I used to work at did that I really liked it, especially for this idea of like stopping willful blindness, is they would always ask anytime as soon as you'd get hired and you were getting trained, what's weird? What looks weird? It's like, you don't have blinders yet. You haven't gotten routinized to our process. What's weird about this process? And I always thought that was a really good, clever way to do it, of asking to new people.
Excellent. Thank you. Next up is Becky, Victor, and Chad. Becky.
I would say you need to compare how much has changed since you've initially made your evaluation to what is right now. And if a lot has changed, but you haven't updated your evaluation, then you're subject to willful blindness.
Thank you. Excellent. Next up is Victor. Victor.
I think the awareness that we can go blind, we can have willful blindness, that particular awareness itself can speak to us. And the second thing is to listen to unpopular opinions.
Wonderful. Thank you. Next up is Chad.
Hi, thanks. So I would say that if it is actually willful, you're doing it to avoid something, and to kind of pull from Marcus Aurelius, specifically within Stoicism, he writes about how if you are keeping true to your integrity, which includes honesty, including to yourself, then that is really all that's in your control. So any externality that you're avoiding by being willfully blind is not nearly as valuable as you knowing that you have your integrity. So that's kind of the approach I would take.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Chad. All right. I'm going to skip the questions on social responsibility. We'll come back to them. So the next question is, can you abdicate responsibility and be happy? Can you abdicate responsibility and be happy? That's the question. Becky and Pegor. Becky.
Say yes, because by abdicating responsibility for something, it frees you up to take on different responsibilities, perhaps better ones that are fit for you or bring greater meaning.
Thank you. Next up is Pegor, Jyoti, Joe, and Jean. Pegor.
Sure, but not for long. Unless you do what Becky says, which is like give up some stuff for some other stuff. But I'm assuming that you're giving up because you don't want to do anything. So.
Got it. Yes, I mean, some of these questions, when this is not, it's not clear by itself whether it is giving up a particular responsibility for other ones or just giving up on responsibility. But here, I think the questioner meant that what if, can you abdicate responsibility as such and be happy as that? Next up is Jyoti, Joe, and Jean. Jyoti.
I would say yes, absolutely. That has nothing to do with the happiness.
Thank you. Next up is Joe.
I think you can, but I don't think you'll be fulfilled.
Excellent. Jean.
Yeah, I shared a story with a group. There's a 3 man laying brake. So they said, what do you do? The first man said, I'm laying a brake. The second one said, I'm making a wall. The third one is very happy doing the exact same thing, and building a palace. I think sometimes you can do very modern thing. If you have a vision in your mind, you can have a totally different experience.
Thank you. Next up is Chad.
Hey, I had an answer, but you had a good point about how responsibility is defined. If you're talking all responsibility, I would say no.
Excellent. Next up is Victor.
I think the idea of responsibility itself implies that it needs to be done. And if we evade it, we can be happy for today, but not for long.
Wonderful. Very well put. Next up is Maritza, followed by Roger. Maritza.
Man, I have to go after that answer. Fantastic answer, Victor. And I would say that it's a question of moderation. If we are abdicating responsibility in clumps or in portions, then perhaps we can find, that inner peace. But if it's done all at once, I mean, Peter Pan seems like a very happy person, but Peter Pan, it's if you consider the fact that every action has a consequence, the ultimate answer must be no, because you can, Peter Pan's very happy, but he can never grow up.
Wonderful. Next up is Roger, followed by Ray. Roger.
Maritza just returned the favor and took my answer, but what I was gonna say was these are exactly the sins of omission that Peterson talks about, right? The idea of, look, we all do it. There's plenty of things that we look at, we're like, I'm not gonna deal with that. But if everyone does it, you might even live your whole life happily, but that doesn't mean it's good for everyone else or even that you're gonna live a meaningful life.
Wonderful. Next up is Ray, followed by Kevin. Ray.
I personally feel that if the means to the end of this is going to bring you happiness is a kind of a false pretense, and I'll give an example. For instance, if what I would like to do is make sure that everybody in the world has clean water, and that's my real motivation, then I feel that will give me real happiness. If I want to clean the bottoms of the ocean with all the garbage and pollution that's happening, and I know that's my real motivation and I'm not doing it for anything else, that will really give me internal happiness. But if I'm doing it because I think I want to make this a goal to get everyone clean water in the world, then I feel that's a different sort of perspective.
Thank you. Next up is Kevin.
Yeah, to be a Peter Pan, it's a hard job too. So give people choice. If Peter Pan, has to be resist to other people's complaints. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up is Jade.
I think it is possible. Again, it depends on temperament too. But if you do have Peter Pan syndrome that we're talking about, let me not call it a syndrome. If you're more like Peter Pan, you might just be able to do it until there are consequences. Like Peter Pan eventually, if I'm remembering the story right, at least the Disney version, at some point he became more responsible and he started to do stuff, but it was because the people he loved were in danger. So it's like, you know, go live it up, but then when the consequences come, then it changes.
Thank you. Next up is Christine. Christine, go ahead.
Yeah, I would say it just depends on what makes you happy. If you're the kind of person who's made happy by just being selfish and enjoying your own, experiences in life, then you might not care that things are going to help everybody else. But if you care about other people.
Thank you. Everybody was talking about Peter Pan. So now let's talk directly about him instead of talking just behind his back. So why is it that Peter Pan is charismatic? What is the appeal of Peter Pan when it is not something that's a sustainable, responsible ideal? So what is the attraction for that?
It needs to be done and it will make me happy.
Give me just a second. Brian, you need to turn off your mic if you're speaking. Okay, next up is going to be, so the answer from Roger, Jean, Chad, Maritza, Joe. Roger.
I think it just has a natural appeal of everyone's default setting of being a child, right? It's of not having any responsibilities, any concerns, any problems or any issues that you yourself are responsible for handling. And that's why it's an appealing, charming thing. It's a very seductive place to be where you don't have to actually deal with anything except the pleasures of life.
Wonderful. Next up is Jean.
I think there's seems assumption between like, if you enjoy your life or you enjoy your responsibility, they are not taking responsibility. So I think Peter Pan showed a childish, like curiosity, and a lot of artists, they have to be that way to be creative. I think people like, there's a fish, a play, you can make job a play. Like in Pike Place Market, people throw the fish. That become a big scene because work can be fine, but people think work should be boring. Responsibility sounds too heavy. Like I have to take responsibility. If you enjoy doing it, it's no longer a responsibility.
So you're saying it's basically a responsible Peter Pan.
Okay. That's childish.
Okay. Next up is Chad, Maritza, Joe, and Jyoti. Chad.
Hey, so I'd say that Captain Hook is depicted as the person who is a grown-up in the story, and Peter Pan does not like him very clearly, and that kind of deters him from growing up. And I think that there's something in us when we're younger, that it may be grown-ups in general or something that is kind of ominous that could make us avoid wanting to grow up. And I just think that's relatable to people in some sense and some, deep archetypal part of them.
Thank you. Next up is Maritza.
I believe that it's Peter Pan is the fantasy. So even if we have a life that we find to be fulfilling and we're okay with our responsibilities, when you wake up in the morning, before you open your eyes, you have this imaginary whatever in your mind. And that's what Peter Pan embodies. Like he's that, that vision that I can spend, 51 weeks of a year on a beach somewhere, and I only have to worry about my mortgage 1 week a year. I think that that's what he's the embodiment of the potential for us. And I think that's what makes it attractive.
I like the quote that Claire put in the chat. His potential itself, like every child. And that makes him magical in the same way that every child is magical. Yes, wonderful. Next up is going to be Joe, Victor, and Judith. Joe.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the idea of no limits. And what's the alternative is Captain Hook. I think that, essentially I'm saying the same thing that Chad said.
Thank you. Next up is Victor.
Yeah, exactly what Claire and Maritza were mentioning. It's what makes him so magical is his potential, and we are not turning down that particular attitude. We are turning down the attitude of not growing up. So that definitely needs to be appreciated.
Wonderful. I don't know who said it, but it's, this is my favorite quote from Jacob Branowski. His idea is that of long childhood. It's like human beings, I do find that with all great people, like you look at Leonardo or something like that, he has that kind of childlike curiosity, which actually keeps on increasing over time, not going down. Louis Sullivan, it's like at the end of his life, he's writing something and you say, wow. And it just keeps on, that spirit of the child, that potential is there even when the actual has grown tremendously. The potential remains there. Next up is going to be Judith, followed by Jade. Judith.
Yep. Well, that's kind of what, I don't know what you were saying, but I was just going to say, I think we should all factor in about 51 minutes of Peter Pan in our lives a day, because I think that, there's something to that. And maybe that's why we never lose it. That may be useful for when we're executing our responsibilities or just, keeping some sanity.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Next up is Jade.
I don't remember the story of Peter Pan very well. I think even with the movie, I never watched the whole thing. So I'm kind of wondering if Peter Pan was actually shirking any responsibilities. Because I think we're all like, but he doesn't want to grow up. And I think it's the question of what that really means. Because there are kids who, that concept of growing up with responsibility. If you're growing up with responsibility, you kind of understand the balance, and you're allowed to be a kid also. You understand that balance between the play and getting stuff done. But if you don't, then you don't do it. But it's like, again, I feel like in the end of the movie, he saved everyone. So, he was a bit of a brat sometimes in the movie, which got people upset. But I think at the end of the day, he knew what was important. I think his priorities were just very different from everyone else's. Some people will be like, well, we need the rolls on the table for the dinner. And he's like, rolls aren't important. Let's just have fun right now. So it's like, I don't care about rolls.
Thank you. Next up is Becky.
I think that he represents a lot of like that recapture of innocence. It's the nostalgia that we all have. Mm-hmm. It's not having consequences, and being able to undo the hardships and the sufferings that we all face.
Okay, so now we're going to go for two last questions. The first has two variations of it. One is, when should you abdicate responsibility? How do you set the limits of what you will not accept? When should you abdicate responsibility? Abraham.
Actually, I was putting my name in for the Peter Pan question.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, I find people like Peter Pan to have a couple of personality traits, which is usually manipulative, narcissist, selfish, irresponsible. And usually if they're responsible for something, it's only because they're trying to win friends or have someone worship them or look up to them.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
Next up is Joe. So Joe, the question is, when should you abdicate responsibility? What limits do you set for accepting responsibility?
We discussed this in our breakout room, and one of the areas that when we should abdicate responsibility is when somebody may be able to answer the call to a problem better than ourselves, or when we also need internally to give up control of a situation, which can be very difficult for us to do. So in other words, I would just the example of, it's easier sometimes for me to do something than to train somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
But I should probably take the time and train somebody else because that's the responsible thing to do.
Wonderful. Next up is Claire.
Yeah, I certainly think when someone can do it better, in agreement. And I think that the overlap here with the Peter Pan is, I think of Peterson's quote, which sticks with me a lot, of like, the beautiful princess becomes the evil queen eventually, right? Culture always corrupts, and having open eyes to those Peter Pans in our lives to let that potential become something, and let your father or your son kind of save you from the underworld if needed.
Wonderful. Anybody else on this question? Last chance. Gone. Jean.
Yeah, I think, I agree with Joe. We need to train, sometimes take more time. We need to train our kids, take responsibility, for example, by doing less sometimes. It takes energy and time, maybe more work than we do ourselves, but it's our responsibility.
Wonderful. Next up is Maritza, followed by Ray. Maritza.
I think we should, and the question is abdicate, yes?
Yes.
Just want to make sure we're still on that question. I think it's when there's a contradiction with our internal virtues. Like, we should never accept the responsibility that's going to impede us from remaining true to ourselves.
Wonderful. Next up is Ray.
Yeah, so I went to a U2 concert, actually. It was about 6 years ago. And before the concert started, they really put a lot of declarations from the United Nations. And I think things such as like child enslavement, physical abuse to women and men, and there was 8 other things which are documented by the United Nations. These are things that we should not tolerate. And it brought me to tears at that concert to see that at the beginning of the show. So I think these are serious things that speak to my heart.
Oh, so, okay, you're saying something else. Okay. Next up is Kevin.
I would say it's kind of teamwork. You need to delegate some responsibility, not just do yourself. I don't like, work with team.
Very good. Claire, the thing that you put in chat sounds very familiar. Where have you seen this before?
This time next week, think about your future self. I haven't actually read it yet, but I'm excited to do so.
Okay, wonderful, wonderful. Next up is the last question for the day. If you like what you're doing, do you still call it responsibility? How do you think about responsibility and things that you love, things that you like? What is the relationship between them? It's going to be Victor, Judith, Jean, and Nick. Victor.
You can trick other people to think that it is responsibility.
Next up is Judith.
Yeah, I think if you have the right attitude, then the things that you enjoy can also be your responsibilities. And then that means you're probably doing your responsibilities in the best possible way.
Wonderful. Next up is Jean, Nick, and Dave. Jean, I know what you're going to say. Go ahead.
Personally, I don't like the word responsibility. And people think I actually take a lot of responsibilities myself, like cooking for my kids, studying nutrition. I enjoy doing it. It's so much fun. I learn so much. I think when you change the attitude with curiosity, everything is fun. Responsibility sounds too heavy. Feel like obligated instead you're willing to do it yourself.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Next up is Nick, Dave, and Joe. Nick.
Yeah, I think it definitely still is responsibility, since responsibility is just something that is needed, whether it's for yourself, whether it's for society. So just kind of to echo what Judith said, that you want to be, when you take the responsibility, you want to get to that mindset anyway, that and be happy about going about that. But that doesn't mean just because you're happy that all of a sudden it's not responsibility, it's not something that's needed.
Wonderful. Next up is Dave. Dave.
Yeah, I enjoy having a responsible job and doing it well. And especially when I recognize I'm doing a good job by my coworkers and boss even sometimes. So yeah, it's a good part of life.
Wonderful. Joe.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that you enjoy raising your kids, spending time with your kids. I mean, these are responsibilities that we have, and so that enjoyment in that framework makes a lot of sense.
Wonderful. Maritza.
Yes, I would say it's still responsibility, but I would say it with a smile.
Wonderful. All right, folks. So this is going so well. I really like this because I think all the three sessions, all the three sections are very good. Let's do one thing. I'm going to do a poll, so you can tell me what you think of this meetup. Let's see. How did we do today? Is that the right poll? Yeah. So here the presentation means the first part, then the breakout rooms and takeaways is this last part. So go ahead and give me your evaluations on each of these. The first one, you can choose as many as you want. If you liked just one of them, you can choose one, or you can choose all three. And then for each of them, the second question is about overall, how was the meetup? And then it is about each of the sections. So one person has voted 2. Just let us know what you think, and we're going to keep on improving things accordingly. So 3. Just take a minute to click. So we got 4, and we're going to all see the results together as soon as people have voted. So we'll continue this. I think this format is working very well, this three-part format. So I'm going to give just another 30 seconds for people to answer the question. Just go ahead and fill up whatever you want, and go ahead and hit done, and then we'll go from that. Any thoughts about moving to 8:30? No, that's not the last hour. No. It's because it's all calculated with different coasts in mind. So 9 o'clock is 6 o'clock on the West Coast. So 5:30 will clash with people's thing, and I've been doing this meetups for a long time. So everybody's used to 9 o'clock, all the other meetups at 9 o'clock. Okay, so we got 14. So I'm going to go ahead and share results. Okay, so let's see. Okay, everybody likes like 88%, 50% like the first part. But 86% like this part, 79% like breakout rooms. Let's see what is overall. What do you guys think? People between excellent 50% to good. That's not bad. Next one is, how was the presentation? Was 50 is excellent to good. The breakout rooms about 57, 29. Okay, and the last one was 64 and 29. Okay, that's not bad. So if you have any suggestions or anything, you can just write to me at 52livingideas@gmail.com. And so thank you very much, everybody. Oh, the co-host couldn't vote? Oh, really?
No, yeah, none of us could vote.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. So it was a very biased polling that I did. But with the people, I know you guys love it. So I'm going to add four points to all the scores as a quick check on this biased reporting that I did here. Sorry, folks. There must be a way I can set it to do that. Okay, I'm just going to check. I'm not going to launch it again, but
I would have put excellent for all.
No. Okay, I'm going to assume that Joe, I'm going to take your vote as excellent. Okay.
Okay.
All right, folks. So thank you very much, and it's wonderful to see this quality of folks coming and this quality of discourse, and just this is wonderful. Thank you.